everyone, and welcome to the Plant Initiatives podcast series where we talk with people about the innovative work they are doing to increase the respectful treatment of plants. My name is Sue Fager. I'm a Plant Initiative board member. Today, I'll be talking with Kollibri terre Sonnenblume, who is a writer, photographer, tree hugger, animal lover, and cultural dissident. They have authored several books on the intersections of ecology and civilization. You can find their work on their Substack, Speaking for the Trees, no matter where they're from, at kollibri.substack.com. Kollibri, welcome to the podcast. Such a pleasure to get to speak with you.
I really appreciate you inviting me on. It's great to be here.
Tell us a little bit about the focus of your work, Speaking for the Trees, no matter where they're from. Can you share more about your philosophy of plants with our listeners?
Right. Yeah, and those two go together. So I started the Substack a couple, 3 years ago at the suggestion of a friend who was on there, and she was finding that it was a good place for her to be trying to spread her messages. And so Speaking for the Trees, no matter where they're from, is what I call a plant advocacy blog. And so the point is to speak for plants, speak in favor sometimes of their rights, but also just of the place that they have in the world and how important plants are in the world. I think that a lot of times plants just get overlooked by most people, especially people who aren't involved in anything, like in agriculture or nursery work or anything like that, or do outdoor things. And so many people sort of just treat plants as furniture, or not even like they're really even living things, And so, different political questions will come up, or policy questions, or different philosophical questions. And oftentimes these discussions end up being very human centric, and vegans and vegetarians do a good job of bringing in animals and animal rights, and I really appreciate those people, and I've always been grateful for the contributions they've had in my life to understanding the world. But just speaking for plants is something that far fewer people do, and so when it comes to when it comes to a lot of issues that the plants play a part that's being ignored, and so decisions get made that turn out to be bad for them, especially when you look at just the logistics of how we develop our society, So how are we getting our energy? How are we transporting things around? How are we where are we living? A lot of these things just sort of ignore plants as being a factor that are there, even though we depend utterly on plants for our existence. This is where we get our oxygen to breathe. This is where we get all of our food. People who eat meat are eating plants through that animal. They're still dependent on plants. And then of course there's the whole more than human world of all the animals and other insects, etc., who depend on plants as well. And people are concerned about extinction, of different animals, but a lot of times they don't take into account the fact that plants and habitat containing plants is a big part of that animal's life, that species' life.
Okay. On your website, you mentioned that the book The Lorax shaped your perception of trees and other plant kin, and that your work is also focused. There it is. The Lorax. Yeah. How old were you the first time you read it or somebody read it to you?
Oh gosh, I mean, well, I can't remember, so I think I must have been quite young, probably 5 or 6. I remember the Dr. Seuss books being around from the earliest age, and then I grew up in the 70s, and there was also the TV animated special that would play like once a year or something like that. And yeah, I remember in the book there's these truffula trees, and they all end up getting clear cut and made into products in a factory. And the Lorax is someone who pops out of the first stump that gets cut and says that he's speaking for the trees because the trees have no voice. So that's where I get the Speaking for the Trees and the name of the Substack. And in the book, spoiler, he leaves at some point, and when he leaves a stone circle on the ground that just says unless. And so as a child, I needed to have that explained to me what that meant. And of
Mhm.
course, it's unless, people act, unless people do things and step in. And so that that I remember having that explained to me at an early age, and that being very profound, a very profound thing. That ending. It's really brilliant. And yeah, I did recently repurchase the book just to look through it again, and it affected me just as much, honestly.
I was going to ask you if, given the elapse of time from your first reading to now, if it affected you differently or if you took something different away from the book.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, and probably the first time I was exposed to it was literally 50 years ago, right?
Right.
I'm a little older than I look. But what I didn't notice as a child, but I did notice on this latest reading, is that he has a very strong critique of capitalism in there and of marketing, those two
Mhm.
things. I'm like, oh, I didn't catch that as a kid, but I would have soaked it in. So that was interesting to me to see that and to wonder if such messages are still appearing in contemporary children's books. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't either. That's interesting. Um, so, kind of a follow along with that, Kollibri, is how have your efforts on behalf of plants evolved over time, over
Right,
those 50 years?
right, right. Um, I would say that I've been a plant lover the entire time. So no matter where I lived, even if it was in an apartment, I would have plants, around. If all I had was a porch, I'd fill it up with pots and grow tomatoes out there, or a gajillion house plants, whatever. So I always wanted them around. But it wasn't really until I moved to the Pacific Northwest to Oregon in early 2001 that I started getting involved, like sort of actively in some efforts. And that was because when I moved to Portland in 2001, I was in like a little hippie neighborhood I moved into in Southeast Portland, which has now been gentrified, unfortunately. But at the time, the local forest defenders, their headquarters was in an office across the street, and they were doing tree sits out in the old growth to try to
Mhm.
stop logging that was going on. And so I befriended them, and they were fun people. And I was doing independent media at that time, so like alternative media, that was like that the internet was just allowing to happen at that point. So I was doing a lot of street media. You go out and you take pictures and film at protests and interview people, or people are having a strike. You go over there and you ask them questions about that, etc. And so I really got into the forest defense issues as one of my main topics. And so in addition to covering their actions in town, I started going out to the forest, with them, and they would have action camps where you would learn about ecology, you would learn how to climbing skills because you need to climb, ropes, et cetera, to get up into the tree
Mhm.
sits. You would learn nonviolent civil disobedience, usually away from the National Warriors Guild would show up and do know your rights, things. So it was quite a mix of skills because tree sits are I mean that's civil disobedience. It's technically illegal to build something
Mhm.
like that in the forest and then to stay there for that long. Um, and so yeah, the forest defense community, that was really what got me going in a very active way. And so then I started then helping out too with going out and uh, looking at proposed tree sits and like helping with the documentation, and let's take pictures of what's here, and like let's try to age these trees, and et cetera, et cetera. And Portland was a really great place for activism in the early 2000s. There was really a lot that was going on then, and there were some successes too. There were some old growth trees that did get saved and remain safe to this day, where we did manage to the get the sales canceled. It
Mhm.
would, it would usually be a combination of the civil disobedience to like pause things, or to stall, basically keep the trucks from coming in while people had lawsuits that were going through the courts.
Mhm.
And so generally speaking, it was a lawsuit that would really end it. but then the tree sets would stall it, and then they would also bring positive attention to it and get people to
Right.
like, write letters to their congressmen and whatever, because getting, getting the politicians to oppose these things was also an important part of that. Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about plant sentience. What does it mean to you? And would you be open to telling us about either your first or other personal experience of plant sentience?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know when. I remember being uh taught by my mother in the garden at a very young age that, plants were special, and she would point to certain plants and be like, and oh, this, we this we started from a cutting from this person, did a root division from that person. And so there was always these connections that were made with plants, and so having that plant in your garden from the other person was a way of having a connection with the other person. So there was that, where I was kind of made aware of that. um, and and growing up in the 70s, and not being allowed to watch much TV, I just spent a lot of time outside there with the plants, laying under the
Hmm.
lilac trees or crawling around behind the hostas or whatever, and just came to love all that activity that was going on, between the animals and the insects and the plants. And I raised caterpillars and the butterflies and this and that. And I looking back, um, I think I was probably receiving and giving communication with the plants. I remember them taking us out to forests too when we were all go nature hike kind of things.
Hmm.
Um, but it wasn't really until I was older, and again, I think probably when I was in the Pacific Northwest, that I began to have more explicit, experiences where I felt like plants were sending me a message or trying to tell me something. And so I did start farming as well when I was in Portland. And that was part of it sometimes. It would be like, okay, there's all these things that on the to-do list today. And then I would just sort of feel called to something, And so I would
Hmm.
get called to that patch or whatever. And I'd be like, oh, yeah, look, it's time to do such and such today, or it's time to do this or that, And so I felt like by spending more and more time with plants, I was able to like sort of, pick up on their needs, not just by looking at them, you know. And I had an interesting experience one summer where I was doing urban farming. I was living in Portland and doing farming vegetables in a bunch of empty lots and backyards all around the city. And I was sleeping in where I lived was an old single car garage that we had rehabbed to be half greenhouse, half like residence. And so I was living in there,
Hmm.
so all my seeds are there. So I had all my seeds were in buckets, piled up, and then my bed was right there. So my head was right next to the seeds at night, And I would often wake up in the morning with a feeling of like, this is the seed I should plant today. And like, I don't know, I was like, okay, are they just talking to me in my sleep? I mean, it kind of felt like it. Um, and then I did have more explicit experiences too. I remember visiting some old growth, the one of the groves that got saved actually a few years after it had been saved, and visiting out there by myself. And I had been having some sort of personal conundrum of some kind. And I went out there, and I was kind of depressed or sad or something, And I went out there to the trees and was just sort of expressing this to them, And I did get I got an answer back from them, They were like, you and your problems are really small.
Perspective, time,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
perspective.
yeah, yeah. These things that seem so precious to you, they're not really that precious. You just need, I mean, they kind of just told me to get over it. It was really an interesting experience, It was like, it was kind of a harsh grandfatherly sort of tone they were taking with me or something like that. But there were words that just came into my head, at that
Uh-huh.
point. So, since then, like I just try to keep my ears open, basically. And um, I feel like how I can tell that I'm actually having like legit communication with plants and not just wishful thinking of like, oh, wouldn't that be cool to talk to plants and sort of convincing
Mhm.
myself that I am or whatever, right? Is when if I ask a question, if the answer is instantaneously returned to me and isn't something I would have thought of, or if the voice of the message just sort of comes into my head unbidden, I'm not
Mhm.
even asking, for it. And so I feel like um uh I feel like I can't always like push for it or something like that, like, you
Yeah.
know, if that makes any sense at all. I don't know.
As an intuitive interspecies communicator, makes all kinds of sense.
Right, okay, you get it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really
Yeah,
cool. It is really cool.
yeah. Mhm.
With your work, you also talk about plant blindness and plant sightedness. Can you share a little more about these concepts? And then also share some thoughts about how our listeners can expand their plant sightedness.
Right, right. Well, I mean, plant blindness, that's an actual term. I can't remember who coined that. I think it was some researchers who wrote a paper. Um, um, but basically, that refers to a little bit of what I was starting to talk about before, which is that, especially in our society, and I don't want to talk about all humans, I just want to talk about our society because it's the one I know
Mhm.
here in the United States, is that most people, they don't notice plants, like they don't notice them around them, first of all. And then if they do, it's just sort of this green blur.
Mhm.
Uh, Maybe they're attracted to like a pretty flower or something in a moment or something like that. But that experience often is not even of the plant as a living thing that's producing this thing as part of its reproduction, mechanism and all that, but just as a purely aesthetic experience, like the same way that they would think that like a painting is pretty,
Mhm.
or a photograph or a sculpture or something like that. And so even then, when people are noticing plants, they're not really noticing them as living things and understanding that that flower represents, relationships, relationships between the plant and insects or bats or whoever it is in that plant's life that then pollinates it, Um, and so as people move through their lives, plants are just something that they're either walking by without noticing, or just sort of brushing out of the way, or worse, just sort of chopping down and digging up just for no real good reason at all. Just I don't like this here or whatever, as if plants are just interior decorating, elements set outside, and so people aren't noticing them in their environment, and then they're also not being aware of how important those plants are to their survival, or
Right.
I mean, because in a city we know that like urban neighborhoods that have lots of trees, those are much cooler places in the summertime, for example. Like they help counteract the urban heat island, effect, Um, and we also know that there's more trees in wealthier neighborhoods and fewer trees in poorer neighborhoods. So it's interesting how everything starts to then, come together there. And um, I think that, I mean, plant blindness is a huge subject because it's also kind of a nature blindness or an ecosystem blindness, too,
Yep.
where where like farming and agriculture is always a replacement of something else that used to be there, It's the replacement of some other kind of habitat that used to be there. And like that's not appreciated, either. That this one thing replaced another thing, and the consequences that might have. I mean, it seems like uh people they know intellectually that food comes from plants, but like they don't really know that food comes from plants, and that those plants are there at the expense of other plants, oftentimes, and so the whole the whole set of relationships is also just kind of not not acknowledged, not noticed. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, how often do you see people talking about plants in a TV show, or a movie, like, and how much You know, how many songs are there, about plants, I mean, there's a few, right? But
I'm
like,
gonna be thinking about that, Kollibri. How
yeah,
many songs are there about plants?
right. I'm sure there's a lot of songs that mention roses or something like that. But yeah, I mean,
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And, I think there's that disconnect that people have with where their food comes from now, right? You
right.
go to that's the food comes from the grocery store, and they don't really think about, oh, wait a minute. There's someone has to plant the seed, someone has to get the field ready, someone has to watch over those plants and harvest and get it to the store. So I kind of get why they might have it if they're not actually growing their own food in their backyard, say, in a pot on their deck.
Yeah, yeah. And then further, I mean, people don't, you know, understand that like for the past many decades now, the number of people employed in the agricultural sector who are not merely migrants, but undocumented migrants is around 50%. It's
Yes,
around
it's very scary.
50%. And so it's like, okay, um, you know, talking about wanting to kick them all out or whatever, it's like, you're not thinking about this at all.
No,
You know?
no. Calibri, that is so true in so many different ways.
Yeah,
But it is scary to think about who is going to pick the food that we all eat. Um,
right. Yeah, it's
so,
been it's been like this for a long time. I mean, California agricultural sector has been using a Mexican,
mhm,
labor, since the early 1900s. I mean, it's a very, so the government has had various programs and various ways of approaching this at different times for how to allow this to happen, and but they're utterly dependent on it. And then a piece I heard the other day I didn't know about before was that there was a big increase in using Mexican labor in California during World War II when they interned a bunch of the Japanese because a lot
mhm,
of them were agriculturalists.
right.
They ran orchards, they ran farms, they worked on them, and so they had to bring in. So when they locked them all up, they had to bring in more people, too. I mean, yeah,
Yeah, that's a whole different history
yeah, it is, yeah,
we could talk about. More topics, Calibri. One of the major areas of interest that you've written about is related to invasive plants and how they're viewed and treated. And we've talked about that a little bit, but share more. How do you
right,
feel about invasive plants and why do you feel that way?
right, right. Um, I first became interested in the topic because in the early 2000s, because I started hearing that term used a lot around Portland. And at that time, I was already, practicing and very interested in organic agriculture, right?
Mhm.
And what I soon found out is that the most common way that plant people use to get rid of plants that they call invasive or noxious or whatever is with pesticides, is
Mhm.
with herbicides. They're sprayed. That's the most common way. Like on farms, on restoration projects, like in natural areas. This is
Yes.
they're using spray. And so I'm like, well, wait a minute. I know I'm opposed to the use of these substances. So how much of a problem is this? Like, is it justified? Like that was how I went into it. I'm like, well, is this justified? Is this a problem? And so uh, it was very interesting. I'm finishing up a book about it. I'm sure we'll talk about that in a second. But like with a co-author. But what my co-author and I discovered as we got into this topic, and we put out a zine in 2018 that we're expanding into a book. What we found as we got into this topic was that you have on the one hand invasion biology, which is a science, a branch of science that's been around since the late 80s. You really kind of got going in the 90s, so it's still a new branch of science. And there's the science, and that's the studying introduced plants and animal, I mean, introduced species, and what are the effects, if any, can we measure it, et cetera, blah blah blah. Like
Mhm.
that's a thing, right? That's a science which is still developing, which is actually very nuanced and does not have a black and white view of the world like as a science. Now, there's researchers involved with it who do have very black and white thinking, but the science itself is not like this is a villain and here's a good guy. It doesn't talk like that, at all. And then so you have that, and then you have a cultural phenomena, what you could call invasion ideology, maybe, right? Which is like, a set of beliefs about invasive species and what they allegedly do, and this one is really fed by, it's fed by the media, it's fed by herbicide manufacturers, it's fed by, various, and then it's fed by various cultural, elements too. So you have what you could call an invasive plant narrative that exists, right? That exists in the culture, that's in the media, it's in books, it's something that people talk about. That's the narrative right there. And then the gap between the narrative and the science is actually far greater than I think most people spouting the narrative, believe or know, and so that's been a really interesting thing to find, is that there's this set of cultural tropes, really, basically, on one hand, and then there's the science, and then there's this gap between them, because the invasive species narrative, it plays on some old tropes that are buried in our culture. The most obvious one is the fear of the outsider, right?
Mhm.
So the fear of the foreigner, the outside agitator, and well, and the outside agitator, that was something they said in the South because they didn't like people from the North coming down to try to break up
Right.
segregation back,
Yeah.
right? So, but it's the same thing, It's this fear of the other, that it's coming in, it's causing trouble, it reproduces too fast, it can do really well in poor circumstances. I mean, a lot of these things are like just slightly different words on these same often racist ideas about immigrants, and all that. So you have that first, the fear of the outsider. Then you also have there's an author called Sonia Shaw, who wrote a great book called The Next Great Migration, and there's what she refers to as the myth of an orderly and unchanging world.
Mhm.
And so she traces that back to the Abrahamic religions and to the book of Genesis and this and that, with this idea that like all the animals and plants, when they were created, were put in a proper place, and that's where they belong. And in that kind of worldview, any sort of change or any sort of migration is viewed as aberrant, because the world is inherently stable and inherently unchanging. And like, we know that's not true now. We know very well that that's not true now. Like the continents move around, like the land
Mhm.
itself is not stable, and we know that because we're currently in an interglacial period and in an ice age. There's a glaciation that ended like 12,000 years ago. There's another one coming at some point, or maybe not if we mess things up badly enough. But with each of those, so like, are you in Minnesota too?
Yeah.
Right. So that was under a lot of ice,
Mhm.
and then so that's why you have those fun glacial erratics in the different places and all that, right? And so during the height of the ice age, it was a completely different set of plants that were growing there. There were places
Right.
where no plants were growing, right? Then the glaciers receded, and then animals and plants came back. And what we now have been discovering from archaeology and various things, I mean, including looking at like pollen and old lake beds and all that sort of thing, is that whenever the ice comes and then recedes, the animals and plants that then return, they don't return in the same proportions. It's not the same every time. Not all of them do return. New
Right.
species, so in the last interglacial, like the last warm period before that, like, there were earthworms in North America. They didn't return after the last ice that receded. So a lot of the earthworms we have now that are helpful in agriculture are introduced, right? So
Mhm.
and what we call the native range of any animal or plant is also not something that's like absolutely solid and set in stone. That's just the boundaries as we saw them at a particular time, in place, and then we can say that like, oh, it's expanding out of its range. So like we also know that, as the planet's been warming, that more species, both animals and plants, are some of them are moving north or up in elevation to like, because it's getting too warm where they were. So they're
Right.
gradually starting to move. So that's a big element too, is that we look at the world as being unchanging, and it absolutely is not unchanging. It's a very dynamic place. Things are constantly moving around. Native ranges are constantly, shifting, shrinking, or getting larger. And I mean, things obviously are going extinct all the time too. What is it? Something like, of all the species that have ever existed on the earth, 99% are extinct now, right? Something like that. So that's another one of these cultural ideas that we have, Oh, outsiders are bad. Oh, things don't change. Oh, look at this invasive plant. It fits, it fits the logic of those stories. But those are cultural tropes. Those aren't actual, like, those aren't factual ways of describing the world, and how it works.
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
that's
there. Go
mhm.
ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was just gonna say there's a city pocket park behind my house, and then there's a hill from the houses down to the park, and the city doesn't mow the hill. And so it's been a lot of fun to watch Succession and to,
Oh
and
yeah.
to see okay, started with just grass when the city stopped mowing. I think around COVID time, someone told me. And then this spring, we got this gigantic patch of thistle, not the big
Oh.
bowl thistle, but the little purple
Mhm,
ones. And
mhm.
my neighbor, oh, you were going to have to do something about the thistle. And I said, oh, no, the pollinators will love it. So it was so fun when the whole patch was blooming, Kollibri, to just stand there and look at that ecosystem, because it was an ecosystem of insects and plants. So we'll see in 5 years' time. Will it just be all full of trees and no more grass and flowers? I don't know.
Right.
But
Yeah, and succession is different every time,
mhm,
too. And I mean, because there's general principles like, yeah, grasses will give way to like other kinds of, weeds, which will give away to shrubs, which will give way to trees. I mean,
mhm,
in general, we can see that kind of thing. But like the idea that succession reaches sort of a climax, and that's where it belongs. Like that's an idea that I think that's Gleason, right? He was the one who first described succession in like the early 20th century. And I mean, he was the one who looked at who was in Nebraska and looked at ponds and grasslands and trees, and were like, oh, ponds, silt up over time to become grasslands, and then grasslands,
mhm,
over time become, forests. And like in the woodland there, that's the climax. That's what it's supposed to be, and that's what it's always going to go to, that thing. And it's like, well, some of the ponds actually do stay ponds. I mean, some of them do silt up. I mean, it's just like, it's not going to happen every time. It's not like the climax is where it is supposed to go, and is therefore
mhm,
always going to go. And if it doesn't, something's wrong. I mean, it's not, it's not like that either. But I mean, there's been so much when it comes to scientific understanding of the world culturally. Um, we're still very much in the Victorian age in a lot of
yes, we
ways,
are.
you know and like, the whole thing of nature being, red in tooth and claw, and it's all about competition. And I mean, competition, that's another, that's so when we talk about when people talk about invasive plants, what they say is that, oh, it's out competing this thing, it's encroaching, it's like pushing it out, so we're looking at an interaction happening, and we're immediately putting this lens of competition on it,
Mhm,
and um uh that is a cultural thing too, to immediately jump to that interpretation and not be like, well, what else could be going on here, so because species that interact, maybe they compete, maybe they cooperate, maybe they have really almost no relationship to each other whatsoever, they're just happening to be in the same spot, right? Because like Darwin, for example, who, was obviously a brilliant man, and who was talking about plant intelligence at the end of his life, as you probably know. um, he when he was talking about the survival of the fittest and this and that and looking at things in competitive terms, it's important to remember that he too was a product of his time. And that doesn't
Mhm.
mean that everything he said wasn't true. It just means that we need to keep that in mind, is that he was living in Victorian England, and it was a really harsh time. This is when you had child slave labor, I mean, not slave
Right.
labor, but child labor in the coal mines, all the countrysides getting ripped up. This is when you have the emergence of this, of who would become like sort of the robber baron class. I mean, and so what we call what we call social Darwinism, this idea that like, oh, well, these people are doing better in society because they're just more fit. You know what I mean? That
Mhm.
idea was already existing in society before Darwinism. That was already the milieu that he was sort of in, intellectually and or culturally, I should say. And so his ideas about competition were really coming out of this, like, you know, sort of the brutality of the capitalism that was emerging at that time, But after Darwin, shortly after Darwin, still in the 1800s, you had Peter Kropotkin, who was the Russian biologist and anarchist, who was like, no, it's actually not about competition; it's about cooperation. And so there was an
Mhm.
immediate, yeah, how about no, but what about this that came at that time that didn't actually get that much attention, um, you know, uh, in part because you had capitalists versus anarchists. That was just the thing that was going on, too, obviously. The capitalists appear to have won for the moment, but I'm not going to give them that one yet. But so so this it's also important to remember that when Darwin was talking about um, competition and survival of the fittest, he was talking about intraspecific, not interspecific. So he was saying that within a species, those that are best adapted to their environment are those that are more likely to survive and then pass on their genes, right? So
Mhm.
Darwin wasn't really talking about plant on plant competition or animal on animal competition in that way that the invasive species trope does, of like, oh, look at the thistle that's driving out the blah blah blah, right? I mean, that's not really what he was. That's not really how he was talking about things. And um, there's so many examples where the presence of well every plant, any plant that you see anywhere is there for a reason, right? So if a plant is growing someplace, it's telling you something about that spot, right?
Mhm.
So um, if a willow tree is growing somewhere, okay, there's got to be adequate water in that. That's not a dry spot where that willow is growing, right? You know what I mean? And like
Mhm.
it's and like some things obviously are not frost tolerant, et cetera, et cetera. So whenever you see a plant, it's telling you something, right? And so when we see a non-native plant, an introduced plant that's thriving somewhere, it's not that it just came in and bullied out its neighbors. In virtually all cases, uh, the introduced plants can only thrive when a disturbance has happened already that's made that space, for them, right? So
Mhm.
um, they're not like paratroopers, just coming down behind lines. They're not tanks rolling across the border. This word invade brings all these images to mind, but it's not really like that. It's more like, we build a road. We run it through this area. To build that road, we have to cut down all the trees, chop down all the bushes. All the heavy equipment comes in, it scrapes the earth away, you know what I mean? Then all the pavement goes down. And then on the side of the road, some plants come up, typically, that are introduced. I mean, obviously native weeds, come up too, but introduced are among those. And in farms, like in agriculture, it's the same way. You come in, you like wipe out, you cut down the forest, or you drain the wetland, or till the grassland, like the tall grass prairie that used to be so
Mhm.
common, in the Midwest where you are and where I grew up. You till that under, and then what you've done now is you've changed the circumstances in such a way that in many cases, the plants that were growing there, they won't grow there anymore because you've now changed it. Like you've scraped away the topsoil, you've changed the hydrology. It's not getting the same water it was.
Right.
It's you wiped out the animals and insects who pollinate it, or who spread its seeds or whatever, right? And then you have these plants come in that do well, often, sometimes called invasive, which we often just call weeds, right? Who are adapted to these circumstances, right? Because a lot of the plants that we call weeds in the garden or on farms, these were plants of like open, freshly disturbed areas that just they loved it when we set up a farm. They're like, oh, it's an open, disturbed area. This is my habitat, and so
Mhm.
they came to be adapted to our disturbances. So the presence of those plants is telling us what kind of disturbance we made in a lot of cases, and it's the plant is not a villain for moving in like that. The plant is just following its own nature and growing where it is. And nature, herself, if we would like to personify her, is like, oh, well, this used to be a wetland. Now it's this like drained field. Yeah, no, I've got something for that. And then here it is. Here's like that's going to be great, right? Like because what nature and what plants want to do is they just want to fill every possible spot that they can.
Right.
They want to grow in every single spot that they can, right? So like, you look at a mountain that's high enough and there's no trees above a certain level. It's because that's as far as trees can grow. If they could grow higher than that, they would, but that's as far as they can make it, right? And so, so the conditions of the place, this is what's ignored. We look at the symptom but not the underlying cause of what it was that happened, And we're also, as part of this, often underestimating how quick evolution can be,
Mhm.
Because we think of evolution as being like this long, drawn out, gradual,
Methodical, right?
process.
Boom, 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 boom. When in
Yeah,
fact, probably this.
yeah, totally, totally. It's totally that. And things can happen rapidly too, So like in the Midwest right now, there's a species of amaranth, pigweed, often called by farmers, and I don't know if it's amaranthus. I want to say tuberculosis. I know tuberosa. I'm not sure exactly which one it is.
Mhm.
It happens to be a native pigweed, actually. Farmers hate it because it's a weed, because well, weeds can be native or introduced, right? So
Mhm.
right, but this pigweed is the one that's becoming that's showing high levels of Roundup resistance. Because you've heard about Roundup
Yeah.
resistant weeds, right? Well, we've only been using Roundup for what in a large scale way since the 90s. In large part because of Monsanto genetically engineering crops that can tolerate
Mhm.
Roundup ready crops, right? So you have corn
Yep.
is a big one, soy is another one, cotton, is another one, and so that you can spray as much Roundup as you want on your soybean crop. There, it's not going to hurt the soybean, but it's going to kill all the weeds. Well, I mean, in that short amount of time, 40 years or whatever, the pigweed is adapting and becoming Roundup resistant. So they start using more Roundup, which is just the worst thing in the world, or
Right.
they introduce now another suite of chemicals to try to kill the Roundup. And so we kind of don't give nature enough credit for being able to change, and that's resilience, is what that is. For the pigweed to be like, yeah, throw it at me, and then just to keep going, anyway, And in that same way, different spaces are resilient too. So it's like,
Mhm.
okay, you put a road through here, or a suburb or whatever it is, or you'd mined here or something like that. Well, we're still going to find something that's going to grow here anyway, and that's what's going to be here, And so the invasive species narrative looks at the plant, points the finger, says, "There's the villain." It's like that's not the villain. That's just a reaction to something that we did. And if you don't like the fact that that plant is there, and you want to see something else there, well, that's fine. You can take that approach, but you'll need to make some underlying changes there. So like what happened here before, that changed it, you know what I mean? So and like on a roadside, some of those places it's just kind of like, well, I mean, good luck. Like if we're gonna, because roadsides need to be mowed regularly, especially in the West where I am, because it can be a fire hazard, from sparks and whatever, And so you have to, only certain things are gonna grow there, like anyway, another form of adaptation that you've seen, I'm sure that many viewers or listeners have as well, is that if you go to like a public park that's often mowed, the dandelions there, the flowers will be on shorter stems. They've adapted so that the flowers will stay below the blades.
Yes,
I
I
mean, this
have them.
stuff's great. It's just it's wonderful. I mean, that's the other thing is you could look at it and you're like, wow, what an amazing, resilient, lush world we live in. That no matter what kind of destruction we throw at it, it just keeps trying to bounce back, and it's using whatever's going to work, and there's always something that's going to work. I mean, that's beautiful. I mean, that's the other way to look at it. Is, oh well, that's beautiful. The life, the life works that way. Yeah, will just give one more example about the causes and stuff like that because this is a good one. Here in the West, uh, two of the most hated quote invasive species are the tamarisk trees and the Russian olives, right? And those are two of the most common trees in riparian areas in the West at this point. They're like number 3 and 4 or something. I mean, don't
Mhm.
quote me on that number. They're very, very common trees, right? So most places that you see them, however, is below dams or in areas where the river has been otherwise changed in some way, right? And
Mhm.
so, I'm in Paonia, Colorado right now, and this is part of the Colorado River Basin. It's the North Fork of the Gunnison here, which ends up flowing into the Colorado a ways away, and then not quite to
Mhm.
the Gulf, not quite to uh, Sea of California at this point, Gulf of California at this point. But so in this part of the country, you have a huge amount of water that comes down the rivers in the spring from the snowmelt from all the mountains, right? And that's how they found it. And then the rivers are pretty low for the rest of the season. They're like, oh, well, we can't farm like that. We need water to be like more regular. So they built, thousands of reservoirs, literally thousands, some small, some quite large, think about the Hoover Dam, for example, or Lake Powell or whatever. And so they made these reservoirs so that they could then like partition the water out bit by bit, through a system of ditches or pipes or whatever. So the farm I'm on here gets its water from a ditch, and because this was a low water year, a low snowmelt year, and the reservoirs were getting low, the water for this ditch, for the irrigation for this farm, got cut off April 12th this year, actually. So it didn't even last the whole season, right? But the only reason you can have agriculture at all in these areas is because you've made you're impounding the water in these reservoirs, right? So what that means is that you no longer have that spring pulse that goes through.
Right.
Well, the common trees before the tamarisk and the Russian olive were cottonwoods and willows, right? They both have reproductive cycles that are utterly dependent on that spring pulse. So when that spring pulse is happening, that's when they're releasing their seeds. And they both have very short-lived seeds. They don't they don't like by next year, they're dead. They're only viable for like a few weeks in the case of like cottonwoods, right? So the spring melt would take the cottonwood seeds, they're on the light, fluffy, you've seen them,
Right.
and it would take them, and then it deposits them on like sandy or gravelly shores as the water goes back down, and then that's the perfect place for them to sprout. And cottonwood seeds have no endosperm; they have no energy chunk with them,
Mhm.
like most seeds do, right? But they can photosynthesize, right? Which is crazy. So when they get laid on the sand or the gravel, they often end up then germinating within 24 to 48 hours. They're ready. They do it. So you take away that spring pulse. Well, wait a minute. That's the main way that those trees spread their seeds. They aren't getting spread anymore. Additionally, when you have the water impounded like that, the water tables sink on the lower waters. So you now need to have longer routes to get to the water. Tamarisk and Russian olive have longer roots, right?
Mhm.
Another thing that happens is that as you irrigate in these areas, the water, you take the water, you divert it into ditches, you put it out over your field, and then because of how the soils are around here, which is different than the soils in the Midwest, there is that they pick up a lot of minerals and salts basically as they rejoin the water table around the rivers. So the further you go downstream in the Colorado River system, the saltier the water
Mhm.
gets, right? Until by the time you get to California in the Imperial Valley, where a lot of this ends up for like alfalfa and whatever, they actually have to filter the water there to get the salts out because it's too salty now to irrigate with, right? So the Russian olive and the tamarisk also both have a higher tolerance for salt in their water. So we drastically change these riparian environments in terms of the flooding, in terms of the water levels, in terms of the content of the water itself. And the cottonwoods and the willows went into decline. And then the tamarisks and the Russian olives, which were introduced for their own reasons, tamarisks for uh, erosion control, I think. They're like, oh, but this is great habitat for us. So now
Mhm.
they're doing great there. And now, people who really hate those trees go around and try to chop them all down or spray them or whatever. And it's like, yeah, but you actually you need trees there. Like if you cut those down, there's not going to be anything in some areas. And the wildlife has come to depend on these trees as well. So there's
Mhm.
an endangered bird called the willow flycatcher, obviously used to nesting in willow, which now nests in the tamarisk too. It's like, oh, there's not many willow around. Oh, this one will do, right? And so
Mhm.
you have anti-invasive people coming in wanting to get rid of the tamarisk, but then you have the bird people being, oh, no, 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 hold on. No, 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 wait. And so it's kind of amusing to see those situations happen. And I'm grateful to the birders. So that's just, I mean, and when if you want to dig into like basically any plant that's called invasive, if you want to, you can like do the research and be like, okay, what's it want? How to get here, like et cetera, et cetera. And it will make complete sense why it's there. It will make
Mhm.
perfect sense why it's there. And then if you want to go further, you can be like, well, who's taking advantage of this plant? Like who's eating it? Who's using it for shelter? Who's, et cetera, like all, I mean, besides the uses the humans have for all these non-native plants, because of course, virtually our entire diet is non-native plants in the United
Right.
States. I mean, in the United States, if we wanted to limit ourselves to what's strictly a wild native plant here that's farmed, we'd have Jerusalem artichokes. That's what we would have, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
that's not really enough, So
Be a very limited diet. So, Kollibri, you mentioned something about a book
yeah,
that you're
yeah,
working.
Nikki Hill is my best friend, and she has a degree in environmental science from the University of Portland. And we put out a zine a few years ago about basic plants, looking at all these topics and starting to get into them. And so now we're working on a book, which we're down to the last chapter now that we need to write. But neither of us write in the summertime because I mean,
Mhm.
I'm outside. We're looking outside things. So, but the working title is "Don't Blame the Messenger: A Critique of the Invasive Plant Narrative." And so it's following in the footsteps of some other critiques, like Carol Ryan has a great book, Beyond the War on Invasive Species, for
Mhm.
example. There's other authors that have done some great work. Where Are Camels From? I can't remember the author. Um, uh, Ours is covering some of the same material, but then this critique of the narrative is really where we're getting at. Because we're like, well, wait a minute, we can look at the science and show how the science doesn't back up these claims the way that people seem to think that they do. But more to the point, why do people believe this? Why does this story appeal to us,
Mhm.
especially U.S. Americans? Why does this appeal to us? And so like that's kind of like the second half of the book. Is the first half we go after the science and show, hey, this isn't saying what you think it's saying. And then the second half we get into the all these cultural aspects to really discuss it, because that's how to really kind of get to the root of it, including in our own heads, to be like,
Mhm.
oh, I'm comparing this weed, this invasive weed to I'm talking about the same way that people I don't like talk about immigrants. Huh.
Mhm.
I don't like the way they talk about immigrants. Maybe I shouldn't talk about this plant this way.
Yeah.
Like we're
Yeah.
trying to, different.
Yeah,
So
that's
we're
really interesting. It's really interesting to think about that, Calibri. Um,
mhm.
so, um, any last thoughts for our listeners? We have covered
um,
a lot of territory in this
we've covered a
short
lot of
time.
territory. Yeah. I mean, I guess I would say that like everyone has plants in their life. of some kind or another already. Basically, no matter where you live, unless it's in Antarctica as a researcher, right? I think everywhere else there's plants in your life, if you're in the city or a rural person or whatever. And so I think that uh well, the kids these days, they say go touch grass, Yeah, that's good advice, right? That's good advice. Go out and like, just whatever the plants are around you, just try to take some small part of your day, even if it's just 5 minutes to start with, and be like, what are the plants that are around me? Even if you're just looking out the window, better yet, go out there, but whatever, just what are the plants that are around me? Like who else is interacting with those plants? Are there butterflies on them? Are there birds nesting in them? And are there, and then when you walk around or when you drive around, what are the plants that I'm seeing, and how does my life relate to them? How do they relate to my life, and how do they relate to all the other life that's in this area? And if you're someone who loves birds, well, you can take that angle, right from the beginning. If you're someone who really likes butterflies, you can take that angle. Because all these roads are eventually going to lead back to plants. And we just tend to be kind of insular and self-absorbed in this culture, and so paying attention to any other living thing is just a good thing for us in general. But plants are they're there, and they're easy to observe too. They don't run away when you go to look at them, they don't fly away, right? So it's very easy to interact with them, and you can get a book that'll warn you which ones not to eat or whatever, but like, or look up, I guess, online these days, but like, because smell them, feel them, what's the texture, if you can eat it, what's the taste, you know what I mean? Like, can I cook something with this? I mean, it's just, people will have a much more full lives, and I think will be less neurotic ultimately, the more that they interact with plants.
Okay, great. So Kollibri, again, thank you so much for joining us and helping us better understand the importance of plant advocacy and connection, and for inspiring listeners to expand their own awareness where they live or the places they love. One more time, Kollibri, where can listeners find out more about your work?
The best place to go these days is my Substack. If I do podcasts, which I do every once in a while, it'll be there. My writing is there, and that's at Substack. It's Speaking for the Trees, no matter where they're from, and that's just kollibri.substack.com, which is kollibri.substack.com. And most of what I post up there is free for everyone.
Wonderful, wonderful. So that wraps us up. It's been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed talking with you this afternoon, Kollibri. And for our listeners, if you're wondering where you can find this podcast or other podcasts, it'll be on the Plant Initiatives YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/@the Plant Initiative.
Thank you so much,
everyone.
I really appreciate it.